Episode 128 of the Read to Lead podcast is brought to you by FreshBooks, offering a month of unrestricted use totally free, and you don't need a credit card to take advantage of this trial. To claim your free month, just go to freshbooks.com/read to lead and enter Read to Lead in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
We all have these biases that are based on our genetics and our life experiences up to this time. We can improve our decision-making ability by not being so affected by those cognitive biases.
Welcome to the Read to Lead podcast with Jeff Brown. Jeff believes that if you desire to achieve true success in business and in life, then consistent and intentional reading is a must. The Read to Lead podcast will not only help you narrow this ever-important reading list, but also bring you key insights and valuable feedback from some of today's most successful and inspiring authors. And now, here's Jeff.
Thank you so much for being here, and welcome to the podcast that is dedicated to your personal and professional growth. Leadership, as you might imagine, is our central topic of discussion. We also hit on things like personal development, productivity, career, business, marketing, sales, and entrepreneurship. It's leadership and personal growth that's getting our focus today. In a moment, you and I will be joined by Matt Tenney. Matt is the co-author of the book, The Mindfulness Edge, How to Rewire Your Brain for Leadership and Personal Excellence Without Adding to Your Schedule. I'll be asking Matt why practicing mindfulness is the ultimate habit for leadership and personal excellence. Also about our cognitive biases and how they can unconsciously affect our performance as leaders. Also, some of the key ways mindfulness training can improve our business acumen, and much, much more. If you run your own side business or do any freelance work, you'd be hard-pressed to find a better accounting solution than FreshBooks cloud accounting software. It's what I've been using for nearly 7 years now. In the past, you may have heard me talk about some of FreshBooks' invoicing features, but actually, FreshBooks has so many more features than that to help keep you organized and streamline the business side of what you do. For example, FreshBooks keeps track of your expenses, and it's ridiculously simple. I have my debit card tied to my FreshBooks account, the debit card for my business, so whenever I use it, those expenses automatically get pulled into FreshBooks. Their mobile app lets you take pictures of your receipts, and FreshBooks organizes those for you for later. FreshBooks can even create expense reports for you and makes claiming expenses at tax time a breeze. All the little details about cash flow are kept in one place, so FreshBooks knows exactly what invoices you've sent, when you sent them, who's paid you, and who owes you what. And FreshBooks can even help handle time tracking. So when it comes time to create that invoice, you'll know what you did and when you did it. But beyond all that, getting started with FreshBooks is extremely simple, even if you're not a numbers person, and especially if you're not a numbers person. Right now, you can take advantage of a month of unrestricted use completely free, and you don't need a credit card to sign up for this. To claim your free month, just go to freshbooks.com/read to lead, and be sure and enter Read to Lead in the How Did You Hear About Us section, and enjoy the benefits I've been enjoying for nearly 7 years now. freshbooks.com/read to lead. Well, our guest today, Matt Tenney, works to develop highly effective leaders who achieve extraordinary long-term business outcomes and live more fulfilling lives as a result of realizing high levels of self-mastery and more effectively serving and inspiring greatness in the people around them. Sounds great, right? He's an international keynote speaker, a corporate trainer, and the author of Serve to Be Great, Leadership Lessons from a Prison, a Monastery, and a Boardroom. He's been teaching mindfulness since 2002, and Matt's clients include Wells Fargo, Marriott, Keller Williams, the Four Seasons, and many other companies, associations, and universities. And we're going to talk to him today about his new book, co-authored with Tim Gard, Ph.D., a book called The Mindfulness Edge, How to Rewire Your Brain for Leadership and Personal Excellence Without Adding to Your Schedule. Matt, I'm thrilled to welcome you on the show. Thanks for being here.
I'm thrilled to be here, Jeff. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, I have to admit that I've sort of internally inside for the last year or so, as I've heard this term mindfulness tossed around, I've sort of had this kind of looking down my nose kind of opinion. And that's really only because I didn't know what it was. I didn't understand it. I didn't get it. But as I've read your book, my gosh, have my eyes been opened. I realized that I wasn't giving mindfulness a fair shake. So let's start, if we can, by just having you define the term for the uninitiated. So what does this mean?
Sure. Well, the term is often used in two contexts. So, the term could be used as it relates to being mindful, or it could relate to practicing things that facilitate being mindful. So you might hear it depending on how it's used. I think there's kind of two definitions there. So being mindful is just a very subtle and quite simple shift from how we normally operate, which in neuroscience they refer to it as the default mode neural network. And that's where, we're kind of identified with our thinking. Our thinking is generally self-referential. It's a lot of past and future. And it's almost as though we're living as though we are our thinking. That's kind of our default mode of operating. Now, when we make that simple and subtle shift to being mindful, it's shifting to actually being aware, having an objective awareness of our thinking, which then opens our other senses so that our awareness is continuously alive to what's coming in the present moment, and we're not distracted by the thoughts going through our head. Now, practicing mindfulness, there are many things that you can do to facilitate that ability to be able to be what I call mindfully self-aware, because that's essentially what we're doing is we're shifting to this objective awareness of the self, where we see our thoughts, we see our emotions, the physical state of the body. So there are many things that we can do to facilitate being able to do that more often and being able to do it when we want to. For many people, we do it accidentally quite often, but there are very few people that I know that can do it without training. They can do it intentionally anytime they want, even in a demanding situation, and also to be able to sustain it for long periods of time. And that's what the training is about.
Well, why do you believe, Matt, that practicing mindfulness is the ultimate habit for leadership and personal excellence?
Well, the reason I use that word ultimate, that's quite, I don't mean to be trite, I guess, with that word or superficial. I actually use it quite intentionally because I think, as you've probably noticed, a lot of the practices that you'll see in the articles that you read about mindfulness, it almost makes it sound like it's this extra, tool in the corporate toolbox where you can pull out this tool and have a little bit less stress, or be more focused on your work or something like that. And those are great things. I don't mean to diminish the value of those things, but mindfulness training and the practice in its entirety goes very, very deep. So you might come at the practice with the intention of being able to improve your decision making, for instance, having better business acumen, which is something the practice can definitely help you do. Or you may want to improve your leadership presence or your emotional intelligence. And these are things that we now know are facilitated quite well by practicing mindfulness. But when you start doing the practice, and especially if you stick with it for a while, you start noticing some much deeper effects. And the reason I use the word ultimate is because some of those effects are really, when we really think about what life is all about, developing qualities like peace of mind, happiness, or qualities like kindness and compassion. These are, when we really think about, okay, what makes life really meaningful, I think these are the qualities we normally think of. And these also develop as a result of mindfulness training. So I kind of look at it, you can come at it from either angle. You could say, okay, I want to practice mindfulness because I'd like to be a happier and more kind and compassionate human being, and that can happen. And you just might get better professionally as a side effect. Or you might come at the practice from the professional standpoint and say, I would like to be more emotionally intelligent or make better decisions. I'd like to improve my leadership skills. And as a side effect, I wouldn't mind if I was happier and more kind and compassionate. And either way, it's going to happen if we practice correctly. If we're not just kind of using this as some magic tool that we expect, we just do a little bit here and there and magical things will happen.
Well, talk about cognitive biases as you lay it out in the book and how they can unconsciously affect our performance as leaders.
Sure. Yes. So I think anyone familiar with the work of Daniel Kahneman has probably heard of this term. And for those of you, I know not everyone has heard of Daniel Kahneman. If you haven't, he and his partner Amos, I never say his last name right. I think it's Tversky. They started doing this work where they realized that people often make decisions that, according to rational choice theory, are just not rational. They don't make sense. And what they realized was that there are these kind of built-in mechanisms, which are now known as a cognitive bias, that actually makes people behave in irrational ways. And because this is something that it's hard for somebody to see unless they have a very high level of self-awareness, but it's pretty easy to see from the outside. And they realized that they could measure these things. There were ways that you can design tests and you can determine what type of bias does somebody have when they go into making a certain decision. And if you know their bias, you can predict with pretty good accuracy how they're going to decide or behave in a given situation. So now I have a colleague at the Perth Leadership Institute who his name is Dr. Ted Prince, and he's a PhD in economics. And at the same time that Kahneman and Tversky were doing this work, he was doing very similar work. He didn't win a Nobel Prize like Daniel Kahneman did, but he realized that there are 10 cognitive biases that have a very direct impact on gross margin and expenses. And so he realized, if we measure these, we can almost predict how somebody's going to affect the P&L. So whether you have P&L responsibility or not, the basic idea here is that we all have these biases that are based on our genetics and our life experiences up to this time. They kind of flavor how we make decisions and how we behave in certain situations. And we can improve our decision-making ability by not being so affected by those cognitive biases. And for those who do have P&L responsibility, there's some that can really affect, how you're impacting gross margin and expenses, and we can improve that too.
Well, let's dig into that a little more. You mentioned earlier that mindfulness training, Matt, can improve our business acumen. So what are some of the key ways that mindfulness training actually does that?
Probably the most obvious ways, most people who have heard of mindfulness associate it with being more resilient in a stressful situation, or they may have even heard of stress reduction.
Yeah.
I don't usually call it stress reduction because I know those of us who are type A, we like our stress. We want to be in demanding situations. And so I think the idea of stress resilience is probably a better way of looking at it, which means we can go into a situation that's demanding and not have so much of a stress response that inhibits our ability to perform at an optimal level. And so that's probably the most basic way and quick way that we see an improvement in decision making, is that when we are in a demanding situation and we haven't trained to be able to be resilient in that situation, and our body engages in the stress response, we actually shift, our brain activity shifts, and we go much more into our habitual ways of doing things. So, if you may be aware that you have a cognitive bias. Let's say, for instance, you don't like accounting, and every time somebody from the accounting department walks in your office as a general manager, you don't really listen to them because you hate that stuff, right? And you're aware of it, right? And so you probably do things to kind of correct for that. However, if things are really if you're really in a demanding situation, you don't have stress resilience, unconsciously you're going to switch back to that cognitive bias of I hate accounting. I'm not going to listen to these people. And as general managers, we should probably listen to what people in the accounting department are telling us at least once a week or so, right?
All right.
So that's one way that it happens. But it also, the practice itself is making us more aware of the cognitive bias, not only generally, but in the moment. So the really being mindful, to come back to the definition we offered at the start, is to be aware of the thoughts going through our mind and be aware of the emotional state of the body. And whenever we have that objective awareness, we can see a thought pattern arising, and we can say, normally I would just rubber stamp this request for funds for this project, and I never look at it. But because I'm aware that I have this tendency to kind of overlook some minor expenses, maybe I'll take a closer look, and then I realize, I don't need to approve that. It's kind of a worthless project. So it helps us see our tendencies in the moment, and then create some space around them where we're not so confined and controlled by our habitual ways of doing things. We can see like, oh, this is how I would always do it. But even though I really want to, because it's very uncomfortable to do things that are not normal for us or not habitual. So we might say, even though this goes completely against my natural way of doing things, I know it's the better thing to do, and I can actually do that. So that's, I think you've probably heard of Viktor Frankl, who talked about the space between stimulus and response. And then Stephen R. Covey came back later and, called that the greatest power that we can develop is that space between stimulus and response. And I think that's kind of what they're getting at here is we have this stimulus coming at us and we have this internal reaction, which many times is habitual. But we can see it and we can say, oh, okay, I don't need to act on that. There's a better response. And mindfulness helps us develop that greatest power that Stephen R. Covey referred to.
I appreciated the example in the book. I think it was the Campbell Soup Company that early this century was sort of, I guess for lack of a better word, run into the ground. And then there was
pretty close.
A gentleman who came along for, I think it was about a period of 10 years, who turned it around in large part by putting many of these concepts into practice. Yeah,
the gentleman's name was Doug Conant, and he actually was relying on a lot of the benefits of the emotional intelligence side, and he definitely made some key decisions, from the strategic side that improved the business in terms of branding, in terms of how they worked with some of their partners. But he realized that unless he had buy-in and engagement from his team members, those strategic ideas were not going to be executed. And so they were facing some incredible engagement problems. I think when he took over, it was not right when he took over. I think it was about a year or two before Gallup came in and measured the engagement levels. But it was one of the worst measurements that they've ever seen, if not the worst, in a Fortune 500 company. I think they had, a number of their not only disengaged employees, but actively disengaged people who were undermining the efforts of other people who were working. So in addition to making some decisions that I think were probably better than the previous leadership did, Conant really focused on the emotional intelligence side of really being a good listener, looking at an interaction with a team member not as something that's keeping him from doing all the junk on his desk waiting for him, but as an opportunity to connect and build trust and understand what some of the issues are from the perspective of somebody on the ground level. And so he took a company that was, like, as you mentioned, was about to either go bankrupt or be bought out. And within 10 years, it turned it around. They had an engagement ratio of 17-1. Gallup considers 11-1 world-class. And in their senior leadership, their top 350 leaders, they had an engagement ratio of 77-1, which is absolutely ridiculous. And he did that fairly quickly. Now, from a business side, I guess for people who are interested in numbers, there was a 6-year period in that span where they had a 60% return for shareholders, and during that same span, the S&P 500 only had a 13% return. So. I know a lot of times emotional intelligence skills and listening and empathy and things like that are looked on as kind of soft skills that may not directly impact the bottom line, but I think there's a pretty good case there that they do.
Yeah. Well, what are some of the ways, Matt, that mindfulness training can help us to be better and maybe more consistent innovators?
One of them is being more free from a certain cognitive bias, which inhibits innovation. So I think you've probably noticed this throughout the years. I mean, probably the most significant block. I mean, bureaucracy is probably pretty close to this. I don't know if you're familiar with research that shows which one's more, but I think if I'm thinking of through what blocks innovation in a team, bureaucracy definitely comes to mind, right? A bunch of red tape, but also fear. And fear may be the number one contributor, because if someone's afraid to not only bring up an idea that disrupts the status quo, but then even more so to take action on it, then you're not going to get anything. You're not going to get any ideas that are disruptive, that are brought to a reality. So one of the ways that mindfulness training helps is there's actually a bias. One of the cognitive biases, as we were speaking on earlier, one of those biases is called the status quo bias. And most people have a pretty strong status quo bias. It's our innate tendency to want to not stand out. We want to be part of a group. We want to fit in. And whether it's conscious or unconscious for us, most of us have a pretty strong, at least that's what the research indicates, that most of us have a pretty strong status quo bias. And as you would imagine, if somebody doesn't want to stand out, they don't want to have an idea that rocks the proverbial boat, then they're probably not going to be an innovator. So one of the things that we can do, and that's, so we're coming back to this, kind of fear-based problem, which is there's a subtle fear there of not wanting to rock the boat and stand out. So one of the ways that mindfulness training helps is, again, coming back to the idea of being more free from a cognitive bias, is we can see that tendency much more clearly in ourselves and see how, wow, I have all these great ideas, but I never mention them, or if I do mention them, I never go to work on them and try to make them happen. And then we can start to, as we see that happening more clearly, again, we have the space to not be controlled by it, and we can actually do something about it. We can say, well, I'm not going to get fired if I take some time to work on this. I know that my boss will support it, and it may be totally outside of the box, but I'm going to take some time to work on this and see what happens.
Well, Matt, what would you say is the most important aspect of what you call leadership presence?
Presence.
Being in the moment, right?
Yeah. Well, I think this idea of leadership presence has a broad spectrum to it, right? So we could think of the very kind of heroic type presence. I opened up that chapter in the book talking about a hero from World War II who just had an unbelievable ability to not get frazzled in a high stress situation and actually put his life on the line for the lives of people around him. And so I think part of leadership presence is that idea of he was making very good decisions despite the fact that they were in a terrible situation and people were very likely to be injured or killed around him. That has to be a stress-inducing situation if there ever was one. And so not only was he able to make good decisions there and lead with confidence, so he had this calm presence that even though, the stuff was really hitting the fan, he inspired confidence in the people around him because he was so resilient. He had that stress resilience that allowed him to lead with calm and clarity in that situation. So I think stress resilience is certainly part of it, and the ability to make good decisions under fire, but I guess literally and figuratively in this sense. But then coming back to the original answer, presence, most of us on a day-to-day basis are not being shot at. We're not worried about our team members being killed or seriously injured most of the time. And we don't have to put our lives on the line for others. But what we can do is we can sacrifice in other ways, and we can really look at, well, what can I do to serve the people on my team members? In various ways, not only looking to help them grow or to empower them, but just on the moment-to-moment basis to be fully present. If somebody's talking to us, to be able to let go of our thinking, put our stinking cell phones down for a minute, and actually listen. And because we're listening, engage and ask pointed questions that really get somebody to open up. I think probably one of the most inspiring examples of this I've seen, and I've tried to emulate this gentleman as much as possible, and I never get even close. But when I was in the Marine Corps, I had the honor of serving under a regimental commander named Colonel Paxton. And, this guy at any given moment had 2,000 to 4,000 Marines under his command. And I, almost to a T, every time I saw him interact with even the most junior Marine, an E1 or E2, he not only knew their first name, he oftentimes knew their spouse's name and a child's name. And I tell you what, when you're an E1 or an E2 in the Marine Corps and a full colonel knows your name and he's only met you for 10 seconds, and he remembers you, those guys would take a bullet for him, and it's nothing complex, right? It's just, he's so present and he has that ability that when he's with somebody, he makes you feel as though you're the most important person that he's going to be with all day. Even if he's going to go talk to, 150 other Marines, when he's with you, he makes you feel like you're the most important person. And that, I think, is something that we can actually train for. And in fact, part of mindfulness training is doing that as a practice. So when you're with a person, It's making the effort to recognize, okay, am I in here talking to myself, thinking about how I'm going to answer what I'm going to say, or am I actually listening? And as soon as we wake up to that and we're just aware of, okay, is there any thinking? What does my body feel like? All of a sudden now we're not caught in our thinking. We can really be present with somebody and listen to them. And I can tell you it's tangible. It is something that people feel when you're with them, when you're fully present with them. It inspires trust. It lets people feel as though we truly care about them. And that, I think, is probably the greatest competitive advantage that we can have as a leader. If we have people that feel as though we truly care about them, genuinely, people go the extra mile. And it also makes going to work more fun. It makes going to work like, hey, I'm going to be with my family, or my people that I really care about. And I go to bed with a smile on my face. So I think that's, again, coming back to the idea of the ultimate success habit, it's not just better performance in terms of business outcomes. This is what we should be doing as human beings.
You mentioned specifically cell phones, and I'd be curious to dig into that a little more and get your thoughts on just what you feel are some of the adverse impacts of our smartphones and technology on this practice.
Well, I don't think it's the technology that's the problem.
Okay.
I think it's the fact that we're not ready for the technology, and if we're not trained, then the technology can become pretty disruptive. So what I mean by that is, although we're pretty complex beings, to a large extent, there's a lot of us that isn't that much different from a monkey, and our brains, for instance, when we receive an email, that really gets our goat, the biological response in the body is almost identical to what would happen if you were being chased by a bear in the woods. The brain just doesn't know the difference. So I think what happens is, there's just so much information and so much emotive power that come with these devices that it's actually creating an addictive response in the body. And this isn't, I don't know how widely accepted this is. I know I've read several articles in psychology journals where people talk about this as though it is a fact. I don't know that if the scientific community agrees that it's a fact or knowledge, but the basic mechanism of addiction is, we have this neurotransmitter called dopamine, which pushes us to achieve something, some type of goal, right? And then what happens when we achieve the goal is we get this hit of another neurotransmitter that's an opiate. It's very pleasure-inducing. And so I think what's happening is it's the same mechanism that would make somebody addicted to a narcotic drug, where you get this drive to get a hit of pleasure, and then you get it, and it feels great, but it goes away real quick. So then you try to work to get another hit. And I think the cell phones make it so easy. It's like every bling or every blung or every doop or whatever sounds they make. It's like, oh, is that somebody that loves me and sends me a message? And then we get like this little hit of dopamine. I mean, of the opiate neurotransmitter, which a pleasure sensation. And I mean, just to consider the addictive power of this, I've actually seen a parent driving a car on the freeway going 55, 60 miles an hour with their child in the backseat who will not only read a text message, but reply to it. I'm thinking, now, of course, there's some overconfidence bias there, right? Like they probably think, well, I'm a good driver. It's those other people who can't text and drive. But that sounds a lot like an addict, doesn't it?
Right.
And certainly putting your child's life on the line to respond to a text, that sounds like the behavior of somebody who's severely addicted. So I think the problem is not so much the device, but how we relate to it. And this is probably a very good reason for most of us to have some type of mindfulness practice, is that without practice, I think, again, our brains are just not ready for it. And it's just so easy to get sucked into these things and addicted to them. But with practice, I mean, using a cell phone can actually be part of the training. In fact, I often teach, like, here's a mindfulness practice. Let's send a text message. And look at how we normally do it. Normally, we're pulled, right? We have that dopamine pushing us to get it done and hit a goal, and then we send it, and then we're waiting for that opiate, hit when we get a response. And it's a very stressful, fast, anxiety-producing event, right? And we're multitasking. Whereas if we wanted to make it a mindfulness practice, the practice would be, okay, let's just do one thing. let's stop. If we're walking, don't walk and text at the same time. It's not good for safety, right? Mm-hmm. But just stop for a moment. Notice what the phone feels like in your hand. Be very intentional about what you're going to type. Notice what your finger feels like on the pad. Maybe even notice what your feet feel like on the ground, or perhaps even your breathing. And when you do that, all of a sudden, you realize, wow, I'm awake while I'm texting this. I'm not just being a conditioned robot who's reacting to some neurotransmitters in my brain. I'm being very intentional about it and present. You'll notice there's a huge difference in how you feel when you do it. You actually notice what's happening around you. You're not sucked into the device. You feel more relaxed, and you probably send a better message because you're more intentional about it.
I know there are studies, or at least I think there are, on this area too. My wife and I both work from home. She has an Android phone and I have an iPhone, so we have very distinct sounds coming from our phones. Only my phone has this sound, for example. And I will go to my phone having sworn I just heard the text sound or the email sound, and I'll go to my phone and there won't be anything there, and I'll realize that I just imagined I heard that sound.
Oh, wow.
Or it'll be in my pocket and I will have sworn that I felt it vibrate.
Right.
And I'll pull it out and there'll be no message there. It was just me imagining it vibrating because I wanted it to vibrate, I guess. It just amazes me how tied we are to these devices sometimes. We spent a lot of our time here in part one of the book. I know you've mentioned some of these things, but I want to walk away with some practical tips or takeaways that we can put into action right now for consistently making sure that we're practicing mindfulness.
Sure. Well, I think as you kind of keyed in on this on the subtitle of the book, which is rewiring our brains without adding to the schedule.
Yeah.
And, that's not just empty rhetoric. In a sense, there may be times, especially as you get more into the practice, you may want to add something to your schedule. But to get started, you can certainly start a practice without adding anything to your schedule, just to change the way that you do things you already do. So, for instance, we have all these activities that we do every day in relative solitude that don't require us to be analyzing and planning and thinking, and yet that's pretty much all we're doing during these activities, like brushing our teeth or commuting to work or washing the hands or preparing coffee or preparing food or eating that food, getting dressed. The list goes on and on. And so what I recommend to people to get started is to make a list of all these activities. And I actually tallied up the time about what I would imagine the average person spends on that each day. And I forgot what it was, but it was not an insignificant amount. I think it was at least 2 hours a day that we're doing this, spending our time doing these types of activities. And what I recommend is just make a list of all of them, and it'll probably be 15 different activities. And for week one, just pick one of those activities and say, all right, this week I'm going to commit to making this part of my self-awareness training, my mindfulness training. And so I'm going to do it differently. Instead of, for instance, brushing the teeth, how we normally do it, or our minds are just all over the place. I have to get the kids to school. Well, this thing is due at work. Oh, the dog just crapped on the floor. Whatever, all the thoughts that are going through our mind. In fact, I imagine most people would relate to this. How many times have you been brushing your teeth and you get through what you think is about halfway, and then you realize, I have no idea how many teeth I brushed. I have to start over, right? Because we're so lost in our thinking. And so, the mindful way of doing it would just be, okay, before you start, just be intentional about the fact that I'm going to brush my teeth just to brush the teeth. This is a practice. There's no goal in mind. It's not to necessarily get clean teeth, although if you're mindful, you'll probably have cleaner teeth as a result. But the idea is to just make that a practice. And so you might just want to pause for a moment, notice what the brush feels like in your hand, maybe just notice what an in-breath and an out-breath feel like, and then just have this really open curiosity, like a little kid, of just, what is it like to actually brush the teeth? So it should be effortless, really. It should just be this curious exploration of, what is it like to actually brush the teeth? What do the bristles feel like on my teeth and gums? And if you make it fun like that, the practice can be very easy. Now, I'm not saying that you're not going to have thoughts come up while you're doing this. You definitely will. But the idea is, if you just recognize them, you could just mentally note, oh, there's some thinking, and I'm going to open back up and notice, well, what else is happening? Oh yeah, there's this toothbrush in my hand and I'm still brushing. And so the idea is, dentists recommend that should be a 2-minute activity, right? So the idea is we could take something, mindfulness is something that we already do. We're already doing it unintentionally. We just don't sustain it for very long. And that's why most of us don't realize any benefit. So what we're doing is now we have this 2-minute gap where we're being intentional about being mindful, and that makes it a way to train the mind. And so if we can sustain it for 2 minutes, and again, it doesn't mean that you don't have thoughts coming up. The idea isn't to get rid of thinking. It's just to see that there is thinking without identifying with it and being pulled into it. So you might notice thoughts come and go while you're brushing the teeth. But if you're practicing correctly, you'll notice that a thought can come up, you recognize it and it goes, but you were never distracted from the activity of brushing the teeth. That's perfect. That's what we're aiming for, is just this open awareness that sees thoughts come and go, it sees sensations come and go without ever just really getting stuck in any of those things. So it's just continually open to what's happening now and now and now. And so then, that way mindfulness training brushing the teeth can be part of the mindfulness training. And so what I would suggest is if you can do that for a week, you might even want to put a little Post-it note next to your toothbrush to just remind yourself, be mindful while you brush your teeth. Then add a second activity for the second week. And, so now week 2, you're doing brushing the teeth and washing the hands or something. And then you can just add an activity each week. And you might notice that after 2 or 3 months, you've got all these little anchors in there where you're kind of waking up and recognizing your thought patterns, recognizing the state of the body. Are you anxious? Are you excited? Are you afraid? Just noticing what's happening in the body. You might notice that you're more present with people around you or what you see. And then you can start to add a little bit more, some sitting still practice maybe, where I know a lot of us, I'm wired to be type A, and most of us type A's don't like to take breaks, but there's plenty of research showing that you'll be much more productive over the long term by taking breaks and taking some time to just sit still and be mindful, which in the way that we just described, just noticing what it's like to sit. Notice, are there thoughts? Are there not? What does the body feel like? And just trying to sustain that for one in-breath and one out-breath as we sit still. You don't have to add anything to your schedule to do 5 minutes of that or 10 minutes a day. Just change the way you take a break. And if you don't take a break, I think the average American watches something like 30 hours of TV a week. Take 5 minutes of that TV time, which is arguably the most unproductive thing we do, and we can transform that into practice as well. So it's just changing the way that we do things we're already doing and changing our default from being identified with our thinking and being really caught in it to actually being aware of it, which opens us up to being aware to what else is happening and making that the new default whenever we can.
Well, I, for one, know that being more mindful about my teeth means my hygienist won't be saying things like, "Boy, you really like popcorn, don't you?" Perhaps, yes. Yeah. Well, before I move on, Matt, to some questions that aren't directly related to the book, is there anything else from the book you want to make sure we walk away with?
Not particularly. I mean, if anything else that you think of that is of value to your listeners, I'd be happy to address. But I don't have an agenda or anything that I want to push forward unless it's of value to you and your listeners.
Well, I appreciate that. As I said at the outset, I have had my eyes opened by this book, and I'm all the way through part 1, and I'm just beginning to dig into part 2, and just have found it fascinating, and I'm really enjoying digging into this subject, and am now going back to others who I know are in this space and giving their work another look with a brand new frame of mind. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. That's a wonderful compliment.
Well, I was wondering, Matt, and put you on the spot here a little bit, if you can name for us some books that you have read that have had a big impact on you, and maybe those titles that you like to go back to again and again.
Sure. A couple that are in my top 10 would definitely include Love is the Killer App by Tim Sanders. That book just really opened my eyes to the idea that we can do things that are meaningful and have a positive impact on people, and it's actually really good for our careers and really good for business. And because that's what I wanted to, when I first started getting out into the world of doing professional training, corporate training and speaking, doing keynotes and things. That's what I wanted to share. And I thought, nobody's going to want to listen to this. They're going to want to know how to make more money. And he just really opened my eyes to the fact that, well, one, it can help you be more successful financially and professionally, but it's just what we should be doing as human beings. It makes life pretty enjoyable. And kind of similar to that is a book by his first book, Adam Grant, Give and Take, is a fantastic book. I almost viewed it as much more in-depth social science research that validates, I guess, what I was talking about in the first book of mine, which is Serve to Be Great. And what Adam showed was that over the long term, people who are more focused on serving and helping tend to rise to the top of the success ladder by almost every single metric. with a few caveats. And this is where I thought his book was so helpful, was that a lot of us want to give and we want to be helpful. But if we don't set appropriate boundaries and we don't make sure that people are held accountable for their end of the deal, we can end up actually undermining not only their careers, but our own. So he actually gives some very pointed instruction based on social science research on how to, not only why being a giver is so important for our professional success, but how to do it in the most effective way. So if you have time to read one book in a year, I think that would be a really good one to start with. From the mindfulness space, a book that I think kind of opened the door for books like mine was a book called Search Inside Yourself. And I've actually become pretty good friends with the author. His name is Chade Meng Tan. He just goes by Meng, but he was employee number 107 at Google and one of their early engineers, built their mobile search. And then ended up teaching mindfulness and emotional intelligence to Googlers, and then writing a book that became a New York Times bestseller, again, which is called Search Inside Yourself. And so if you're interested principally in mindfulness as it relates to emotional intelligence, that is a great introduction to mindfulness-based emotional intelligence training. In fact, Daniel Goleman actually partnered with him to create the program at Google. And as I recall, I think he wrote a foreword to the book, or one of the forewords. I think John Kabat-Zinn wrote the other one, but that's a fantastic book as well for those interested in mindfulness. And he started to touch on the neuroscience supporting how mindfulness training, it looks like it's actually rewiring our brains in ways that are pretty good for us.
You mentioned Tim Sanders. We had the pleasure of having him on the show here just a few weeks ago to talk about his latest book.
Deal Storming, right?
Yeah.
I have not read that one.
Very good.
I've heard good things.
Yeah, very good. And I believe you mentioned Ming in your book.
I do, yes. Yeah, and there's a chapter on emotional intelligence, and I just wanted to point out that this type of training has been happening for some years. And Google's their program has been very effective at Google, and there's now a institute called the Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute, where the acronym for that is SILLY, and that was intentional, actually. There's some pretty fun-loving folks there. But that, they've been doing training with quite a few organizations, and people are reporting some pretty nice effects, not only in terms of professional performance, but you get people commenting things like, "Wow, my wife talks to me now," or I actually enjoy my life. And the people that feel that their lives are being changed.
Well, you mentioned public speaking, and I know you do that internationally. What are some of your tips, Matt, for making sure you're delivering an impactful and memorable talk?
Well, I think the most important thing is to only talk about things that we really care about and that we try to live. I mean, I'm not saying that we have to be perfect at it. I'm certainly not perfect at the things that I talk about, but I really care deeply about what I talk about. And that makes it very, very easy. And perhaps closely related to that is, before I get up to talk, I don't think of, am I going to make the best argument, or am I going to be super convincing, or am I going to say everything that I have practiced in my speech to say perfectly and never say an or something like that. What I focus on is, there's 500 human beings in this audience, or however many are in the audience. And I have this amazing opportunity to serve them, and hopefully not only have them take away some tools that could help them to enjoy their lives more and be more successful, but then through a ripple effect, make their family life a little bit better, their community a little bit better. But even at a higher level, I think just in the moment, I want people to feel as though I actually care about them. And so I try to generate this energy of service and kindness and compassion for the people that I'm going to speak with, and that may sound a little silly, but I've noticed that I actually am pretty afraid of public speaking by nature. I don't particularly enjoy it. Like if we're at a table and everyone's going around introducing themselves, I actually turn red when it's my turn to introduce myself. I don't like everyone looking at me, and I don't like talking about myself that much. But there's something that shifts when it's not about me and it's about what can I do to really care for the people that are in the audience. And I've noticed that I pretty much don't get nervous anymore. In fact, if anything, I get excited. There's a little bit of kind of nervous anticipation. It's more of excitement about, wow, I'm going to go do something I really love and hopefully inspire some people to be awesome human beings or keep being more awesome as human beings, as many people already are. So those are, I think, probably the two biggest takeaways I would offer is to, and I guess one more, which is very closely related, is to be present, is to not worry so much about being perfect up there, but to try to really be present with what's happening within ourselves and in the audience. And I think those three things, that's what can make a killer speech. And I don't want to use myself as an example because I don't think I'm the best speaker in the world, but I'll give you a great example or two. Simon Sinek and Brene Brown. Simon has become a friend of mine, and I think his first TED Talk is close to 30 million views now. And if you broke down his 18-minute talk, from a Toastmasters point of view, for instance, it's not that good. The audio wasn't that good. They had to change his mics. He was very stiff. He was nervous during that talk, but he really, really cares what he's talking about, and he tries to live it. And so it came through. And Brene Brown is the same way. Her first TED Talk, which I think is well over 20 million views now, was actually it was a TEDx event. And she was just very vulnerable, which is quite appropriately what she talks about. And she was really authentic, really present, not trying to be perfect. And people just connect with her. So I think that's more important than saying the right things necessarily. I'm not saying that we shouldn't plan well and have a well-designed speech, but more important than any of that is to really care about what we talk about, have an energy of serving the people that we're with, and to really be present, which helps us come through as very authentic and genuine while we're speaking. And that's what creates a good connection with the audience.
I very much, for what it's worth, identified with your struggle between sitting around a table and having to talk about yourself and being in front of the room and talking about something you care about and that the audience needs to hear. My reactions to those two situations is very similar to yours.
Oh, really?
Yeah, very much so.
Cool.
Yeah.
I thought I was alone in that one.
You are
some
not.
Weirdo.
No, I totally get that. Well, I know the book's only been out a few weeks, but I wanted to give you a chance, if you'd like to, Matt, to share what's next. Are your team, you and your team, working on anything right now that's around the corner, or anything you want to talk about or promote?
Well, I'd like to promote goodness. Can we do that?
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's what I'd like to promote most, is that we, really focus on what we can do to be present with the people that we interact with every day and to make their lives a little bit better. And I think that not only makes life more enjoyable, but it's pretty good for business too. But to be on the product side, no, there's nothing around the corner right now except for trying to get this book in the hands of as many people as we can, so that people have some skills to be able to do those things better. Probably, maybe even more important for me right now is my little 6-month-old son. So I'm spending a lot of time with him, to the detriment actually of getting the book marketed well. But I figure, the book's, it's in a disc somewhere, it'll be printed for years to come. He's only going to be a baby for once.
That's right.
He'll be off to school before I know it. So I'm trying to spend as much time being present with and serving him while this is out.
Well, you certainly have your priorities in order, it sounds like. Well, hopefully I can do my small part in helping get the word out about this. Well, Matt, thank you so much for being on the show. It was a pleasure to have you, and delighted to learn that you're a fellow Nashvilleian, so maybe our paths will cross here face to face here soon.
I hope they do. Thanks for having me on the show, Jeff. I really appreciate it.
You'll find links to all the resources we talked about, including Matt's book, Matt's website, and the books that Matt recommended on the show notes page created especially for this episode. That can be found at readtoleadpodcast.com/128 for episode 128. Please consider visiting our sponsor and taking advantage of that free month-long trial. It's freshbooks.com/readtolead. I want to give a special thanks to Skybird, who in iTunes just left a 5-star rating and written review, saying that being someone who prefers to listen to books while I live life rather than sit down and take time to read, I have found the best of both worlds in this podcast. This aspiring leader is becoming a reader. I'm telling everyone I can about this show. Thank you so very much. If you've yet to leave a rating and review for us in either iTunes or, say, Stitcher, we certainly would appreciate it. You can visit readtoleadpodcast.com/iTunes or readtoleadpodcast.com/Stitcher and do just that. And if you think we're 5-star worthy, we'll be sure to reference your rating and review in a future episode of Read to Lead. Well, that does it for this week. I look forward to seeing you next time for the next edition of the Read to Lead podcast.
Thanks so much for listening to the Read to Lead podcast. As a subscriber, we challenge you to be more than just a passive listener. Become a vital member of the community. Visit us on the web at readtoleadpodcast.com. Until next time, remember, leaders read and readers lead.